Not trusting the 18th century guy. Actually, I wrote a 19th century novel, so that was me moving to the current era for me. We about ready, do we think, or?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So welcome to the appallingly titled class that I've volunteered to teach, called Love in the Age of Coronavirus, with apologies to Marquez. I couldn't help the steal. It was prompted actually by, in preparation for the Good Friday reflection that I gave, I had the first chance I'd had in some time to think systematically about what this strange period of New York on pause, to use the governmental term, has meant in our lives, and certainly in my own at any rate. And what I found is I kept recurring to the phrase C.P. Snow used in his book, Last Things, which was arrest of life. And he used it to delineate a time period where everything's in suspense and where there's a sort of forced passivity that kind of blanketed his own life in writing, which was the inspiration for his novel. And so that really resonated with me, in particular, feeling how the city, which I have only intermittently been in the last few months, but really everywhere in the state that I've been, including up here in Albany, where I'm speaking from, has been frozen. It's almost like those insects in a bead of amber, where there's not much, life gets constricted. And that's been a part, according to several papers, several pieces I've read in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, one of the things that is concerning to mental health and public health experts is the trauma of having life being in suspense for an extended period of time. Now, in a way, that's not an entirely new experience, because we've had, in 1918, the 1918-1919 flu had a similar effect in certain areas of the country, and in certain other areas of the country, people just ignored it, got sick, and had very bad outcomes, to put it mildly. But in a conversation with my parents, who were both in their 80s, they kept saying, my mother in particular kept saying, we've never had anything like this. And in her lifetime, that's true. And so looking at where do we find a way to have this period be not a lost in the wilderness experience, but more like the field is fallow so that we can grow, that we can come back possibly energized and more in touch with our own souls and in touch with God, seemed to me worth thinking about and talking about. So the way I'm proposing to do this is I'd like to, each of the weeks of this class, focus on a particular author or one book. Tonight we'll be focusing on the book of Job, because what could be more life affirming and enjoyable than that, right? As we deal with Job, I hope that we will be able to talk about some of the things that the book is and isn't, because to me, it always has surprises. The book is in a very real way a paradox, because what it seems to be, I actually don't think it is. By that, what do I mean? I mean, most scholars, and I double-checked this by looking at a couple sources. In addition to the 1965 Anchor Bible volume on Job, I consulted Collins's book, Introduction to the New Testament, and I also consulted the NRSV annotated Bible from 2001. And the general perspective that one hears a lot about the book of Job is that it is a theodicy. That is, it is a defense of the goodness and the omnipotence of God in the face of evil. In other words, okay, evil's out there. God allows it to exist because God is able to conquer evil or destroy evil. And yet God is good, even though evil is out there causing harm and destruction. How do we reconcile these things? So the first thing I'm going to propose is, if we look closely at the book of Job, I think we can see that it's not what it's been painted as, i.e. a theodicy. It is not a defense of the goodness and power of God in the face of evil. It is, in fact, a very strange book. It's a strange book because it's part of a very popular genre that existed in the East for many years before the Hebrew Bible was written down. The fragments of Job that we have are estimated, and it's all estimated, of course, because there's no real way of tracking it, but the most conservative estimate I've seen is that it's from the 7th century BCE to maybe the 5th century BCE, but there are possibilities that it's a throwback even further, and that it is a codification and expounding of a much older text and a much older story. You can see there are parallels to the book of Job from the Sumerians, from the from Qumran, which is subsequent to the book of Job itself. But there are a series of Babylonian, Egyptian, and other variants of this story. The story of the good, righteous person who suffers unjustly is a recurring theme in early writings, even before the earliest possible date for this book. One of them is called the optimistic slave. And the story is a master keeps seeking to come up with a solution to why he is unhappy and keeps going to his slave. His slave jumps up in the air with excitement saying, yes, your suggestion is the one we should try. Try that and all will be well. And then the master says, well, no, wait a minute. If I try that, it won't work out, and gives a reason. And the slave says, you're right. There has to be another way. And the story keeps going on and on with the master trying to find ways that will justify the unhappiness that the master is feeling. And finally, the slave comes out and says, well, you could be worse off. You could be a slave. And that's the end of that one. So these meditations on suffering have a long pedigree in the ancient East. Another interesting thing is Job is not a Hebrew. He's not an Israelite. He lives in the land of Edom. He is an Edomite. He is of the tribe of Esau, which split off and went its own way. Finally, before we get into the meat of the story, there's the first appearance of Satan. Now, Satan is not an adversary of God in this story. Satan is someone who has full rights to come right on into the heavenly court and speak to God and speak to controvert God. And it is, of course, the dialogue between Satan and God in the preface, the prologue rather, of the book of Job that starts the action. And we all remember the basic of the story. Satan comes in, says he's been here and there about the earth. Oh, then you've seen my friend Job, who is righteous and good and is a faithful servant of mine and loves me and trusts me and is in all ways obedient to the law. Well, of course, naturally, he's all of those things because he's rich. What more could he want? He has everything. He's got 10 sons, 7 daughters, food, a lovely home, everything that he could conceivably want, he has naturally. He loves you. Well, I don't think that's why he loves me. I think that he could be He just loves me because he loves me, and the rest is just the benefits that come along with it. Fine. I bet if he didn't have those things, he would no longer love you. He would curse you. God says, take them away. See what happens. Job's children all die horribly. He loses everything he has. He still says, blessed is the Lord. We then move, God then says, you see, he didn't curse me. He still blesses me, even though you've taken away everything. Skin for skin, says Satan. Skin for skin. He's not suffering in his person. So of course he still loves you. Something has still been saved. God says, fine, just don't kill him. He is afflicted with incredible torments in the physical flesh, illnesses. By the way, there's actually an earlier Babylonian one in which the description of the torture of the physical pains goes on for a really extended period of time. And it's a little worrying about the mental health of the person who wrote that particular one, because it goes on and on. But in the book of Job, we get a brief description, and all we know is that Job is really not feeling well and very uncomfortable, but he's still able to sit on a dung heap and scrape himself with a potsherd. I have no idea what a potsherd is, but I'm sure it's not something you would like to have to scrape yourself with. So.
It's a broken bit of a ceramic pot.
I was afraid of that. I was so afraid of that. Pot shard, in other words.
Yes.
I wasn't going to go there because I didn't have a chance to double check and the spelling was off for that, but figures. In any event, so Job is told by his wife, why are you still praising the Lord? Curse God and die. He refuses. He remains unwavering in his faith. And then we get to the core of the book, which are the debates between Job and his supposed comforters. Basically, the comforters are three so-called friends who come to Job, and yes, I know I'm doing a very brief, broad brush, quick exegesis of the plot. Come to him and say, it's all your fault. You must have done this to yourself. You sinned and God is punishing you, because that is the world in which God lives. Now there's the theodicy, right? The comforters, the so-called comforters, are the ones who are using traditional arguments that can't be God. God would never be unjust. You have to have sinned, my friend Job. And when you realize what your sin is, identify your sin, repent and return to the Lord will heal you. And that's how the world works. And all three of the comforters give very, very lengthy and beautifully poetic responses along these lines. But Job's not going there. He absolutely refuses to accept that approach to to his suffering. He does not accept that he has sinned because he's not aware of having sinned. He has followed the commandments that the Lord has laid down upon him. He has been obedient. He has been good and generous, and he lists all the good things he's done. And he makes the point that to the best of his ability, he has always obeyed the dictates of the Lord. So, in argument after argument, Job refuses to concede that he has sinned and can identify his sin. Now, we then get to the denouement, where God himself comes. And he comes to before Job and the comforters. And he basically says, who are you to call me to account? Can you hope to understand why or how I do anything? Were you there at the creation? Can you comprehend the marvels of the stars, the animals, the infinite wonders of existence? You, a worm that lives a few moments and dies. And Job falls on his face and abases himself before God. And God then turns around and upbraids the so-called comforters, because unlike Job, they have not told the truth about God. Okay, do you see why I say it's paradoxical? What's the defense of God? God would not be unjust. That's what all the three comforters say in different forms. Despite that, Job has said, I have not sinned, I have done nothing to deserve this. Whatever has happened to me is not because of sin on my part. And Job has been vindicated. God has said that the comforters are in error. Now, how can this be? I will confess that the book of Job has been a real confuser to me, except for the fact that a popular novelist went into it at a fair degree of length. And I'm going to steal a very long quote from Herman Wouk's War and Remembrance. Now, Wouk sets the scene that Aaron Jastrow, the Talmudic scholar, is in Theresienstadt, which was called the Paradise Ghetto, where a certain amount of discussion clubs and literary activities were permitted for a time. And so Jastrow is giving a speech on the Iliad, and he gets into a compare and contrast between the Iliad and the book of Job. So here is the first bit from Wouk's analysis of the book of Job in War and Remembrance. In Job, as in most great works of art, the main design is very simple. His comforters maintain that since one almighty God rules the universe, it must make sense. Job has sinned. Let him search his deeds, confess, and repent. The missing piece is only what his offense was. And in round after round of soaring argument, Job bites back. The missing piece must be with God, not with him. He is as religious as they are. He knows that the Almighty exists, that the universe must make sense. But he, poor, bereft, oil-covered skeleton, knows now that it does not always make sense. That crazy injustice is part of the visible world and of this life. His religion demands that he assert his innocence. Otherwise, he will be profaning God's name. He will be conceding that the Almighty can botch one man's life, and if God can do that, the whole universe is a botch, and he is not an almighty God. That is the one point Job will never concede. He wants an answer, and I've already described the answer God gives. But then Jastrow continues, my friends, Job has won. Do you understand? God, with all his roaring, has conceded Job's main point, that the missing piece is with him. God claims only that his reason is beyond Job. That Job is perfectly willing to admit. With the main point settled, he humbles himself, is more than satisfied, falls on his face. So the drama ends. God rebukes the comforters for speaking falsely and praises Job for holding to the truth. He restores Job's wealth. He has 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. He lives 140 more years, sees grandchildren and great-grandchildren, dies old, prosperous, revered. So, again, we come to the paradox of Job. The paradox of Job is that there is no answer that justifies the suffering of human beings in the face of God's providence, plan, indifference, what? Now, obviously, I'm wearing this, so I'm not here to say that God is indifferent. I'm here to say that the book's paradoxes aren't quite done yet. Is it a happy ending with the book of Job? Well, what about the 10 children who were killed? What about Job's wife? What about all of the people who depended on Job for their survival, who were his slaves, his farmers, his tenants? What of them? And then one last quote from Wouk. Can the scars of Job's heart heal even in 140 years? Where was the justice to Job's children, the children he had before the ordeal? But that's not even the worst of it. What is the missing piece that was too much for Job to understand? We understand it, and we're not so very clever. Satan simply sneered God into ordering the whole senseless ordeal. No wonder God roars out of the storm to silence Job. Isn't he ashamed of himself before his own creature? Hasn't Job behaved better than God. So ends Herman Wouk on the subject. So that's the question. What is this book seeking to convey to us? Because it is clearly not seeking to convey what many theologians have taken it to mean over the centuries. It cannot be a theodicy because there is no good explanation. As Wouk says, we understand the truth that Job didn't because we were there for the first part of the story, and Job's not. And in point of fact, the book of Job was known to be a parable at the time it was collected as part of the Hebrew Bible. The Talmudic scholars have written, Job was not a person, he is a parable. So this isn't a realistic story. This is a parable, not in considerable more detail than any parable we have in the New Testament, but it's the same kind of thought experiment. We're being asked to look from a very different place than one normally thinks of when one says, well, how does suffering fit with a just God? Now, some scholars have argued that Job is about obedience, period, the end. Even leaving aside the fact that I would find that to be a surprisingly unpersuasive rationale, just on its own, the fact is, Job is obedient, despite everything that happens. Others would say, Job is a story about reposing one's faith in God, whatever happens. That suffering is not understandable, it's incomprehensible. We are just going to have to know that God is our lodestar throughout. That's a more plausible approach, right? I mean, that at least jibes with some of what we believe as Episcopalians, that God never wills suffering, but is always there with the sufferer, right? That has some weight to it. That has some power to it. And yet, it doesn't seem to fit what the book has told us. So has Job behaved better than his creator? That only works if you take the story not as a parable, but as a truth. And if you think about it, in many of the parables that Jesus tells us, the actors in the parable aren't always fair, aren't always just, aren't always kind. The master who gives out the talents doesn't warn everyone, I want you to make more from them. Here, I'm entrusting you with this, take care of it. Suddenly becomes, and how did you not at least get me interest in the bank? You get nothing, you're out. Or you're invited, the wedding guests don't come to the feast. So people are brought in at the last minute. One of them is not in a proper festive dress and is thrown out. Like that person ever had an opportunity to get a festive dress, right? Parables are not fair because parables are known to not be truthful, factual, police court fact, New York Times reportage. They're a heightened story to get a point across. So what is the point of the book of Job, and how can it assist us in our own experience in this age of coronavirus? Thoughts, comments, concerns, snide remarks? I've gone too fast on something. Hearing nothing, I'll blunder on. Okay.
Wait,
So,
I have,
please.
sorry.
By all means, please.
So now at this point in my life, I struggle with Job because when I was younger, I, take it the way it is. But now I conduct hearings at Department of Social Services, and all day, every day I see people, denied welfare and food stamps, and just, awful situations, huge volume of people. And what I take from, it has a happy ending. And in the stories I see, that is not the case in most instances. And there's lots of God-fearing people and you do the right things. And I'm not articulating this very well, but it's kind of hard to reconcile all that, because Job in a way is saying, do the right things, be good, we restore, you'll be great, life will be
Mhm.
perfect. God will take care of you, kind of.
Mhm.
But the real world is not exactly like that.
I agree with you. I think you're exactly right, and I think you articulated it extremely well, if I may say.
Thank you.
In
Now
my
I'm
view,
myself.
I mean, truthfully, I think that the problem with theodicy as a whole is that you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You're trying to make everything fit and say, see, it's a happy ending. But of course, we know in Job, it's not a happy ending at all. I mean, Job's lost 10 children. That's not getting undone. He gets 10 new children, but I'm sure he was rather fond of the 10 he lost. And Mrs. Job had some reasons to be pretty hacked off about the whole thing, too. So the paradox is that the question is, how does Job survive his ordeal? Bruce, did you have something you wanted to say? Sorry, your little square flashed up, and I don't like to talk over people, so my apologies. Okay, so it's a paradox, I think, because instead of giving us what we think we want, which is a happy ending and a nice simple answer, and oh look, Satan lost, God won, Job's vindicated, and yay team, it actually makes us sit with Job in the ashes with the potsherd, wondering what on earth we are doing here. And just to restate, a theodicy would be an effort to tell the story in such a way that it is a defense of God's omnipotence and goodness despite the existence of evil. And I can't, now, I say with two esteemed clergy colleagues on the call who can completely point out my obvious error, so hopefully I'm not about to make one. I'm not aware of any theodicy that has fully worked. Now that's a huge statement. Note that I threw in fully in there to give myself a little wiggle room in case someone comes up with a really good one. But my view of theodicy is that theodicy is an effort to avoid the very real problem that Sue has posed, which is it doesn't work that way. That's not how life works. That's why Woke has Aaron Jastrow telling the story literally in a concentration camp. Because Jastrow, who is speaking on Woke's behalf at this point, is someone who is an urbane scholar who nonetheless is forced to acknowledge that his urbanity, his wisdom, his knowledge is not helping him. And so what does he fall back on? He finds in his identity, in claiming his Jewishness, in claiming his faith to God, that he finds meaning. And so here, and this is a leap, but every time I read the book of Job and every time I rethink Woke's commentary on it, I keep coming back to the same point. What gets Job through his ordeal? He refuses to lie. He refuses to compromise. And he holds fast to his identity that he is the person who has done what he was told to do. And therefore his suffering has meaning even though he doesn't know the meaning. And now for the big leap. One of the books I was given to read as a teenager was Man's Search for Meaning. I attended a Catholic school that was very heavy about wanting to make sure we got well-versed, not just in having read the Bible, but in understanding that religion served a purpose. And despite all of the unpleasantness that my experience in a very severe disciplinary school afforded, I must say they gave me a very good exposure to a lot of things I wouldn't have read on my own, including Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which I don't know if any of you have run across. Frankl was a psychiatrist actually, and he was caught in the concentration camps, and he survived. And when he came out of the camps, he wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning, and then its sequel, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. And in those books, he drew on his experience in the camps to say who lived and who collapsed. And even some of the people who collapsed and physically survived didn't spiritually survive. His answer was the people who had found a way to invest in something bigger than themselves, a belief, a cause, a church, a faith, it didn't matter. An allegiance to something bigger than self and self-gain was life-generating, even under the worst conceivable circumstances. And so that's where Frankl comes out. And Frankl kind of reminds me a little bit of Job fighting the paradox, because what Job is doing is by finding a way to refuse to say anything that would falsify his relationship with God and his sense of who he is. He has something to defend every day he's on the ash heap scraping himself with a potsherd. So how does this apply in the world of people who are denied their benefits, of people who are treated unfairly by the system of government or by any other system in which we live, by society at large? How does that apply to the victims of the coronavirus, who see who lose their family members, who see their families taken away into hospitals and kept away from them until they're healed and hopefully healed? How does it apply to us in this period where our whole world is on pause? Sorry.
It seems to me that it's about the thing that underlying everything, even though bad things happen to good people, that we're taught that God is with us no matter what we're going through. Whether you're denied your benefits, you're going to lose all your money. I heard an NPR lady was eating tissues the other day because she had no money and no food. It's horrible. It's going to get worse.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense who died. A lovely person I know died, and that why him? There are people that lie and cheat, and they're still alive. So all we can say is that God is with us, and I guess that kind of is what kept Job going. He didn't deny, didn't separate himself from that. And I liked your phrase, I guess, from the Wolf, that everything must make sense. I think our human software must make us want to have things make sense. And that doesn't make sense, but the only thing, why bad things happen to good people, but the only thing is the sense is like God is there somewhere. We're reading the Psalms and centering prayer, and there's a lot about you have to have faith and trust and that God is there. But it must be really, really hard when you have to eat tissues because you have no food.
Yeah, that one I hadn't heard about eating tissues. That is serious.
It was on yesterday morning. It was horrible.
But it's a fascinating thing about seeing poverty and injustice and cruelty. And at the very beginning of my legal career, I was a criminal defense attorney for the Legal Aid Society doing appeals. All of my clients had already been found guilty. And most of them were doing serious sentences. And the thing that was really tricky about that job is until you immersed yourself in the facts of the case, I literally had no idea whether I thought my client was innocent or guilty. You had to go through the whole record, because you'd read something, oh, this could be innocent. Oh, no, wait. And you'd find something else. And going through the whole experience, one of the things I found out is that the prisoners who cared passionately about their innocence. And I don't mean we're just saying, let me out of here. I mean, genuinely maintained their innocence, had a greater degree of mental acuity, of calmness, and of purpose than the prisoners who were just scared because they were in a big metal cage in a prison upstate. And I think part of it is because they had something to believe in, to hold themselves to, which was they believed that they were innocent, that they had been treated unfairly. And rather than just rage, they tried to be a part of their own process to try to right the wrong.
It's like that innocence was the truth. They believed in the truth, and the truth is God, is truth. So, that's a good point.
Well, I think it goes beyond, in a way, truth is definitely one of the attributes of the divine, but I think to me a fascinating thing in reading Man's Search for Meaning was that in Frankl's experience, it didn't, as long as the cause was something bigger than one's own narrow self-interests, then it was possible for someone to survive the worst, however bad that worst was, because they felt that their lives had meaning and that kept them spiritually alive. And so whether or not they were atheists, agnostics, Jews, Christians, whatever, those were the people who had the ability, the greater ability, to survive with that completely being crushed through the experience of the camps. And, you know, Frankl's book is quite interesting because most of it's a memoir. He gets into some psychological concepts towards the end of the book, but the first 2/3 of it are his memoir, giving example after example of what happened to people who had things that they still believed in despite where they were, and other examples of people who believed in nothing but themselves and thought of themselves as being clever enough to manipulate the system and to find ways through the cracks, and they failed. So that then leaves us with the problem of, okay, so we're conceding, at least I'm conceding that the world is unfair, that the rampant injustices that Sue described are real, that God does not protect us from them, and that nonetheless, a belief in something beyond get me out of here, beyond self-interest, can be life-giving, whatever that it is. Now, obviously, because we're here at St. Bart's, we believe that what we do, that what we believe in this church, that what we believe in our liturgy, that what we believe in our practice of being Christians together matters. And in a way, that's sort of like a big support group, right? Where all of us finding meaning in something other than the difficulties and problems of life that nonetheless equip us in some way to address those problems and those difficulties. Taking a pause to see if questions or concerns.
Well,
At a law school, please.
Yeah, I'm thinking I don't think anybody's really that sure, and you have to deal with doubt,
Mhm.
and and suffering, and then there's something that triggers that you can kind of move to the next step, and it might be some affiliation of a person going through the same thing, and then actually be surprised. And that energizes any small thing can be a surprise. But I think it's not like, we can believe just because that's the way it is. It isn't. It has to be interact with where you are, but it needs a very strong force, and usually if you can make some contact with another person, that's a big help as trying to do it alone. My theory is usually don't anticipate what God wants. Get up, say, look after me, I'm going to go my direction and guide me. And then you kind of have to take responsibility and allow that to happen. But I'm not sure if I'm adding anything to this conversation. But
no, I think you are. Any follow-up or other thoughts?
John, I'm wondering if how much you think the label of wisdom literature is important to understanding the purpose of Job. I don't know if that's too much of a leading question, but I'm curious if you think that's a helpful term.
I mean, I find it more helpful as an organizing point in the text of the Bible than I do in terms of illuminating Job. Because I think that Job is, in a way that I don't think that the other wisdom literature is as self-evidently, Job is kind of in conflict with itself as a piece of literature. It's posing up until the very end as being something that it's not. It seems like for much of the book that the comforters are right. And they have these great arguments, and the arguments go on, and they're really all very eloquently phrased. And except in the Living Bible, which dumbs down everything. I can't recommend it. Keep away from the Living Bible. Bad idea. The arguments in Job are all very powerful. Job's argument as well as his comforters. And the comforters make serious headway because they start from common positions held by Job as well as by themselves. Job agrees that God is omnipotent. He believes that God is good. He does not understand where he is and why he is where he is. And so one of the things he does is he allows himself to rage. And Job allows himself, he never curses God and turns his back against God and life. He does not do that. Drop a little footnote here and say, Job's wife's advice, curse God and die. If you think about it, we all know people who have followed it. I have known in the little suburb that I grew up in, my neighbor across the street, basically, when he had to be put into a nursing home, he basically turned his back to the wall and waited to die. He was a friend of mine. He was a much older friend. He was a friend of my parents. And when I would go visit him, he would speak to me for a few minutes, but he was doing his best to just give up on life and turn away from the world. And his decline was very quick, and he passed away in a shorter period of time than one would have expected for someone of his level of health. And I bring up that really tragic story because we can curse God and die. We have agency. We can turn our backs. We can lose our whatever belief or whatever meaning we have, and we can give up. And we see a lot of that in our world today. We see a lot of people who are living in what I can only call a nihilistic way. And I don't say that came out, I'm going to actually retract that a tiny bit. That came out way more judgmental than I intended it to be. And I don't think it's a thing that is willed or chosen. I think it's an example of what happens in a more subtle way than what Frankl was talking about when one loses belief in meaning. It's not that we choose to, oh yes, I'm going to throw myself off the cliff, or I'm going to drink poison, or I'm going to use drugs and die. Rather, it's when there isn't meaning to sustain life, then life won't be sustained. And human beings need meaning, or they'll turn for some way to anesthetize the brains. We're too clever. We can't go without having something to believe in, to have as being, I'm groping for the right phrase here. We can't live productively and happily and well-adjustedly simply for the next sensation. And when that's all there is, that life is in danger. And I think that's a much better way of saying what I botched just 2 minutes ago. We'll just edit that out of the tape, okay? So when we look at Job, we see someone who refuses to give up on life, even though he is bewildered. He's furious, he's angry. Note that Job does not get censured for this. God does not say, and by the way, Job, how dare you say such things to me? Where was your reverence to the Lord your God who created you out of ash heap? And so you've been returned to ashes. Why is that not just? There's no claim on God's part that this is justice or fair. In fact, Job is praised for speaking honestly, even in rage. So what does that tell us? Now, obviously, I'm not here to recommend that people go and scream at people or at God. But, you know, Buddy Stallings used to say something that I always liked. He would say, if you need to yell at God, he can take it. And I confess I find that to be helpful, because in any relationship, honesty needs to be involved. If we believe ourselves to be in relationship with God, then there has to be communication, right? I mean, for me, prayer is not me trying to change God or get God to give me blessings or things that I want. It's a way of trying to know God and know what kind of relationship, not know, that makes it sound like something that's susceptible of being plumbed, and it's not. I think a better way to put it is it's an effort to actively be in relationship with God. And in that relationship, there has to be truth. So, while no, I don't get up and give angry prayers to God, I do pray over things that have made me unhappy or are causing me stress. And it isn't all just liturgical prayer out of the daily office book. Feeling is a part of relationship. And I think that part of what the book of Job is saying is hurt and pain and anger directed at God, when combined with an absolute refusal to stop believing in the goodness of God, is almost like a parent-child relationship, right? The crying infant, or the toddler, can be very angry. Doesn't mean he or she doesn't love the parent who they think is not taking care of them at that moment. That anger isn't hatred, it's desire for things to be right. Yes, please. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought you were had something to add because the green light came up again. Apologies. So we come back because I can't get away from the point that Sue made about how life is unfair in the courtrooms and in the hearing rooms. And having done a fair amount of that stuff, I know exactly what you mean. How do we get this into a more productive place? You know, I mean, I think that you'll see that I think there's a lot we can learn from Job and from this book. That I think it's paradoxical because its whole structure is set up for it to be, oh yeah, okay, right. It's all just, I'm the schmuck. And in fact, it's commending an active engagement with God that can be brutally frank and brutally honest and passionate. But again, how does that translate to people in the world who are on the wrong end of injustice, who are suffering injustice? How does that help people in the world in which we're living today, where we've seen, I believe as of yesterday, more people have died of the coronavirus in a few months than died in the entire Vietnam War. More Americans, to be precise. That is a very large statistic. And I think from the last stat I saw, which admittedly was early this morning, so could have gone up, I hope not, we're coming up on 90,000 people who we have lost. And as Governor Cuomo says, none of these deaths is just a number. They are each a family that's been wounded and is grieving. And so what do we do in this period of artificial calm that isn't calm for everyone, because there are lots of people who've lost their jobs and are trying to navigate an overly taxed unemployment insurance system, I should say, who are trying to obtain benefits to which they're entitled and are running into difficulties and snags, and people who are grieving the loss of their lives, the lives of their loved ones, rather, the losses of their careers, at least intermittently or temporarily. And we're looking at a world where radical insecurity is something that is real for the first time in this country since the Great Depression. I mean, we've had this hollowing out of the middle class over the last 40 years. That's a real thing. But this is much more like the Depression, in that it's everyone and it's worldwide. So how can we take what we've learned from Job, or what Job has to say to us, and apply it? Is it something that can be applied?
To go back to the what you said a few minutes ago about the anger, towards God, it feels as though, and this is obviously just a personal
Please.
interpretation, there's a great transactional nature that goes with faith, and I wish there wasn't. But, and I'm not conscious of it. But when we talk about stuff like, day to day, Sunday to Sunday, but when we're talking about stuff like this, I wonder if a lot of people, and I wonder if I am on one level, a little resentful. Now, I've never been a person to say, oh God, why didn't you save this girl from dying of leukemia who I knew when I was a kid? Oh God, why did the towers fall down on people? I consciously, I don't have a transactional approach to faith, but I wonder if it's there. I wonder if it's there for everyone. And the more distanced we are from the normal rhythms, and the more we're leaning into our faith, or what we have always taken to be our faith and relationship with God, maybe people are struggling with those questions. Gosh, I'm angry. I pray hard. I'm really angry. And so I wonder if that, and I don't mean it for it to sound crass, but there sort of feels as though there is a transactional part of that relationship that perhaps is more difficult for people now.
I think that's absolutely true. I don't think it's true of everyone to the same degree, but I think in our subconscious, many of us, if not all of us, have some of that. I know I do, because we are all, we're all people of the book. Those of us who have been churched from childhood, grew up with the Bible. Those of us who have not been churched from childhood have come to have some level of knowledge of it. And there is a lot of classic theodicy baked in to the Bible. There's a lot of basic of the classic theodicy. The children of Israel are always punished by their losses in battle, and their exile is always explained in terms of they ceased to love the Lord and to follow the law, and they had to be taught a lesson. And so I had to send in the Amalekites, the Babylonians, whoever, to conquer them and to reduce their pride. Again and again, we see that in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we similarly see the promises that are made that if we take them literally, they may not show up the way we expect them to be. In other words, being a Christian for Paul is a sacrificial lifestyle that comes with a level of benefit at the end. Now, I have just done the most crass and reductive reading of St. Paul in the history of theology. And if he were here, he would moan in pain at my injustice to him. But there is that in some of his writing. He keeps saying, race for the prize. Chris, you wanted to say something?
I don't want to interrupt this train of thought, but I have some responses when you get to the end of your train of thought.
Okay. So understanding that I'm really grossly libeling St. Paul, and that aspect in his writing is not the dominant note. He's, after all, the apostle who talks about we are free from the law, we are free to love, and he writes in very loving tones in all of his letters. My point is there is an element of those who are the chosen of God will, and the followers of God and the sons and daughters of God will have happier lives than if they weren't. And that creeps in to full flower in the Calvinistic worldview, and not John Calvin himself. I mean, yet another person who'd be cross with me. And I seem to be hacking off all the great theological thinkers in Western civilization tonight. So clearly I'm on a tear. But if you, in Max Weber's The Spirit of Capitalism, we see that the Calvinistic worldview, that the person who does well in their calling is one of those most likely to be saved. That's Protestant. The actual title of the book is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I would have prepped for it tonight, but I didn't think I'd be going there. That's just an answer to what Chris was saying. So in Weber's analysis, what the Protestant ethic in its Calvinistic form shows is no one can be sure that they're saved. We don't know who's the elect and who's not. And therefore, we hopefully are if we prosper, because if we're prospering, we're doing something right, and therefore God is favoring us. Again, I am taking tiny trace elements from various thinkers, St. Paul, Calvin, and I'm blowing them up into large signposts to make the point that at a subconscious level, that transactional element might be there. Chris, you've patiently waited. Thank you.
Okay. When I raised my hand, I was going to go back to something, a couple of thoughts before, but let me just say about the whole transactional thing. I hear what you're saying, and I transactional thinking that creeps into our attitudes about prayer that I find troubling, even though I can fall into it myself. But we talk about St. Paul. St. Paul also argues that grace is free and that we can't earn grace and that we are saved by grace, and that the thinkers of the church who criticized James's letters did so because James implies that works matter, and a lot of the other thinkers say that works don't matter. So there's a lot of lack of clarity, shall we say, even amongst the church fathers about what we can or can't do. And in the Old Testament, we do see a very punishing God, but my understanding of that is partly that it's the people of Israel telling a story, and that's how they experienced it at the time. That says more about their experience than it might about the nature of God. But what I was really ever since you started, this keeps circling around, is when you say the classic theodicy, exactly what you mean by the classic theodicy. And second, a question is are you assuming that the world should be just, or that there's a claim made somewhere that the world should be just or is just? So those are questions I have based on.
So the first, my answers to the questions are no, I'm not assuming
clearly
that, sorry? Oh, sorry, I think we just had a temporary echo there for a second. My apologies. Okay, so the first answer is no, I'm not assuming that the world is just. And I think that what I've called offhandedly the classic theodicy construct is a construct in which the circle is squared to make the earth just, because the only people who suffer are the wicked. Now, you will see that the Old Testament and the New Testament do not, and here I agree with you, Chris, do not take that line consistently. That through line is there at times. In the problems that the Israelites experience every time they fall away from God and are smited for it. Or is it smitten in that context? Well, anyway, similarly, Paul can have some articulations that do sound transactional, but I agree completely with what you say about grace. And in fact, when we get to Nadia Bolz-Weber, it's going to be Luther, Paul, and Nadia Bolz-Weber talking about the free gift of grace and its liberating effect. So there's a coming attraction. And I think it's important to understand that what I'm really trying to do here is I'm trying to tease out of the genre, the literary genre of the theodicy, as used in the Book of Job and in the other ancient texts that give other examples of theodicy. The notion that there is an inherent justice in the world is a powerful literary stream that runs through the entire course of civilization. You can trace it all the way back to Sophocles, where Sophocles has Oedipus suffers because he kills his father. That he does it in ignorance is no excuse. He does the deed and sleeps with his mother, and his sin that takes down his entire house is because he has sinned, however unwittingly. Same thing with King Arthur and Mordred, 2,000 years later, almost 1,500 years later. Similarly, you see the same concept that sin begets its own punishment. You can see in Shakespeare that the world revolts at the natural order revolts at a tyrant. So Macbeth and Richard III are constantly troubled by portents and signs and examples of ill luck that nature itself is opposing them. King Lear, the same type of story. In E.M.W. Tilliard's The Elizabethan World Picture, the whole notion of the great chain of being, which began, I haven't read this thing in like 30 years, so forgive me. The concept you can trace the concept back certainly to the Greek drama, and it runs all the way into the 17th century. where sin begets disaster and murder will out and blood will have blood and all of the happy Jacobean tragedies that come after Shakespeare, the concept is that there is a rough justice to the world, even though it's far from perfect. Now, I'm not here to defend that through line. I'm merely suggesting that because of its ubiquity in cultural artifacts that have generated sequels and copies and been retold time and time again, that notion exists as sort of part of our cultural subconscious, if that helps. Did I answer your question or dance around it, Chris?
You broadened my things to ponder, shall we say. I don't disagree that there's a drive for justice and a desire for justice. I absolutely agree with that. And I've always loved the quote from Martin Luther King, although I'm not sure it's original to him, that the arc of history bends towards justice and that kind of thinking. I would in another forum argue a little bit about the one theodicy versus many theodicies, but that's not, I'm trying to follow your, so I don't want to distract from where you're going, the argument that you're making.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. You'll appreciate I'm not trying to say that what I've been calling the classic theodicy is every theodicy. There are many, many variants. You know, when you're talking about an entire literary genre, it's like saying, we're going to talk about the mystery story, and I confine everything I say to Sherlock Holmes. That's not going to work. My point is that what I'm calling the classic theodicy is common enough that it has left a mark throughout all of our cultural history, and that it's a significant part of our cultural baggage. Not that it's exclusive, and not that there are no theodicies that don't avoid the traps of that theodicy. I think it's certain. I think there is no. I don't think anyone's absolutely nailed the response of how can we show that God is good, God is omnipotent, and yet evil exists. I don't think anyone's completely squared that circle, but I will admit that by taking the current that I'm using the one that both fits what we hear argued throughout most of Job, because each of Job's comforters gets responded to by Job, but the comforters have very lengthy speeches, and Job sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. And my point is that these arguments are weighty enough and have credence enough that for most of the book, the feeling is that Job is on the defensive. And that's really kind of the point I'm making, is that the book seems like a naive, what I could call a naive theodicy rather than a classic one, if we wanted to signpost the fact that there are others that are less naive. So the book starts off seeming like it's going to be a naive theodicy, and I conclude that is at the end not at all naive, and that it's actually much richer and deeper than that, if that helps clarify what I'm trying to propose here. But now we come back to the real problem. Okay, this is great. It's been, I'm enjoying sharing all this with you, and hopefully I put none of you to sleep yet. But where do we go from here? Or as we used to say in EFM at the end of a lengthy discussion, so what? Where does this get us? Thoughts, questions, concerns?
It seems like the church has some possible role in this, that we can help people to see the subtleties and not the direct, everything's logical and fair and, it's got to make sense. And it seems like the numbers that we're seeing of people who are watching our services and watching the meditations and whatever, people are seeking something that's helping them, possibly, hoping it'll help them to get away from what history has proven or tried to prove, that there is logic to this. There isn't. And the church, one thing we can do is to be there for everybody. And you've been there for all of us. And we can continue to refer people to this kind of thing. But that's a small step for man to have us be able to be in these forums and to learn things online that we can help us crack that old thinking.
Yeah, I like that, Kathleen. It's to me, it's, well, God created everything, but not everything is perfect, and there are viruses, there are bacteria, there are people who make mistakes, there are governments who make mistakes, there are bad judgments, bad paths, but we are here and we are called to hold up each other. And instead of people finding logic, like you said, in what's happened, or finding somebody to blame or blaming God, well, look for God in the people around you, and that's where you'll find God, instead of saying, well, why did God create this virus in the first place, or why did God let the government people do what they've done or not do what they haven't done.
I think that's a very good point, and I think Kathy's as well, and I thank you both for them. One of the things that came to mind as I was listening to both of you was, do you remember the television program The Good Place? The Good Place was a television program about several people who died. They found themselves in the good place and they weren't happy because one of them was there by mistake and the whole thing was a comedy. But the point of it was they actually seriously explored philosophical questions of what it is to be good. You can see the whole thing on Hulu, and at the moment we all seem to have plenty of time to watch Hulu. So The Good Place postulates the question of what is it to be good? And towards the end of the not quite last season, this last but season, a question is brought up of, well, wait a minute. You think you're doing something good, but it's actually evil because of a huge lengthy chain of causality that is so old and so buried that no one knows about it. So for example, you're buying a car that's a hybrid and it's an electric car, and yay, that's wonderful, except the parts are made by slave laborers in Indonesia. What's the ethical choice? And the question that the program raised was, when the chains of causality get so long and so buried and so interwoven among themselves, is trying to be ethical simply leading us to paralysis? And the reason I mention that is this: we're not called to paralysis. We are called to act. We're called to trust in the grace, the freely given grace, to walk into the world bravely as we can, and believing that what we do matters. Not objectively, not logically, but it matters in the sight of God, and it matters to the people whose lives we touch. And I do firmly believe that. I think that is one of the great truths that my odyssey, after being unchurched for a decade, back into the church through St. Bart's, has meant for me, is I have a keen appreciation of how very little it takes to bring comfort to someone. Small things have great impact. The part I was terrified of when I was having my ordination training, my pre-ordination training, I should say, was I was terrified of the 9 months I was going to spend in New York Presbyterian Hospital trying to be there to work with the sick. What was I going to say? How was I going to help? What could I do? And 9 out of 10 times, people were just like, no, don't want to see you. No, oh, it's him again, get out. And the one smart thing I did in the entire 9 months was I suddenly realized I was the one person they could throw out. Because doctors come in and they have to see them. Nurses come in, they have to see them. Patients are always at a disadvantage. So I walked in and just very cheerfully said, look, hi, I'm John. I'm with Pastoral Care. I'm the one person you get to throw out. And a lot of people availed themselves of that. There was one woman said, yes, you are the one person I get to throw out, and I'm throwing you out. But that made her laugh, at least. It was a moment, a beat. It wasn't nothing. And I guess what I've seen in our parish and in other parishes, I did a year at St. John's in the Village where I had a wonderful experience. And people taking care of each other, supporting each other in times of sorrow and of joy matters. We can be the leaven in the lump. We can be the people who help those who are on the rough end of the existence, who are on the cutting edge of life and are bleeding from it. And yes, sometimes big efforts are required and sometimes small efforts are helpful. So I guess what I'm taking from Job and applying for myself to the coronavirus is I believe Job is refusing to be passive, refusing to accept things the way they are. I don't know why I'm thinking so elusively today, but there's a great moment in the 1980s movie, The Mission, where two priests are standing together. One says, "This is the world we live in." And the other priest replies, "No, this is how we have made the world." And the second priest is accepting agency, because that which has been marred can be repaired. We're not simply helpless. Individually, sometimes we are. There are times when we're helpless, right? If you're too sick to take care of yourself, or too sick to be able to act, or if you're someone who is on the wrong end of the hearing and you're being denied benefits that you need in order to support your family or yourself, yes, then you're helpless. And that's a terrible feeling and a horrible feeling. But very frequently, all of us have the ability to be a catalyst and to help others, if only in reaffirming that they're valuable and that they matter and that they're important. I believe that is something, Job refuses to take a position that is untrue, that he sinned and he deserves what's happened. He's perfectly willing to submit to the will of God as long as he can accept, as long as he is vindicated in his statement that the missing piece, the meaning, is not something that he created, but rather it's with God. And so that search for meaning that we started with Viktor Frankl, that search for meaning can be incredibly life-enhancing, and it can be a source for how we find ourselves able to accept the time in which we're living, which is we're hopefully starting to rev up back to something like normal life. But it won't be normal for a long time. How long, I don't know. It won't be this strange stasis we've been in. We'll get to leave our homes more often. Some of the rhythms of normal life will return sooner than others. But we're all a part of that movement back. And what they're hoping will be a reimagining and a better way of going forward. I mean, we've just spent like 3 months proving that we can do without an awful lot of the day-to-day life. And in that 3 months, the planet's tried to heal itself a little bit. There are lessons there. Sir. Ma'am. I'm sorry, that's Bev. I beg your pardon. I pointed the wrong square.
That's all right. Driving the street today in Topeka, Kansas, I saw a yard sign that said, "Be kind."
Mm.
And I said, yes. And it's been with me all day. I hope that it's been with many other people who drove by and saw that yard sign. I sort of want to go back and go knock on the door and say, yes, thank you.
That's marvelous. I love that. That really is terrific. I kept stealing, you know, the last few sermons I did before this all came down, I couldn't help but quote the writer Stephen Moffat, who was repeatedly in various pieces he wrote saying over and over again, be kind. He was finding all kinds of different ways of articulating it. And the point was, everything in his ethical framework came down to always try to be nice, but never fail to be kind. And I liked that. So I think that sign's terrific.
Yes.
There was actually a report on NPR today about Jacinda Ardern, or I forget how to pronounce her last name, but about how key to the effectiveness of her coronavirus response was emphasizing kindness in a way that other world leaders didn't, and that was part of what made her so popular and effective during the pandemic. But to put a slightly more negative spin on things, is the God in Job a cruel God, or is the seeming cruelty of the God in Job, explained by the fact that it's a literary device? Is that a way to?
I'm going with B. The God in Job is like the king in some of the parable of the wedding guests.
Right.
That is not it. Job is not. You know, as I said a while back, Job is self-consciously a parable among the wisdom literature, and the Talmudic scholars were pretty clear that long before, in the first generations of the Talmud, so we're talking maybe 100 years after Christ's life, it was well known. No one believed that Job was a real person in the Jewish community. Job was not taken as a literal historical account. And so Job is a literary figure even in ancient times. We didn't suddenly discover Job was a parable. It was always known that Job was a parable.
That helps me out, because the whole deal with, Satan saying, hey, God, why don't you let me do all kinds of horrible things to Job and let's see what happens? And God said, sure, go right ahead. It's like, really? But that's not right. That's not good. Mm-hmm. But it's almost as if, okay, well, Satan and evil are around everywhere and trying to get us, whether in our own minds or our own devices or other people or bad things that happen. And if you find ways to withstand that God is here to help us do that. It's all sort of like condensed, right? It's like God says to Satan, go ahead and just throw everything at him all at once.
Well, I certainly think that Satan is the advocate. He's sort of a prosecutor, if you will, of human fallibility in Job. He's not the devil we come to later see in Christian myth or in the apocalypse, let alone in horror films, where he, has a good rapport with the directors. But Satan is a sort of bureaucrat whose job it is to test the faith of human beings and to ensure that God knows the truth. Again, another literary device. And so I do think that this book is extremely thought out. It's really quite marvelous. Once you get past the surface level of it, it has a strength and a clarity, I think, in terms of what it is that Job does that is righteous and how his friends, who aren't such great friends, are unrighteous because they're trying to get Job to admit that something is true that he knows is not true. And so, like the parables Jesus tells, this parable is at much fuller length, but it similarly has a tremendous, literary power to it that helps us to see the spiritual insight at the end, that that truth in relationship with God is critical. That being able to complain to God. I mean, look at the Psalms. How much fury is, what C.S. Lewis calls the vindictive Psalms are really quite awful at times. And the Psalms can be beautiful and turn ugly on a dime because they're passionate and the passions run high. So I see we have 1 minute left of our allotted time. I hope you'll all come next week where we'll be talking about C.S. Lewis. We're going to look at 2 of his books, The Great Divorce and A Grief Observed. Thank you.
Backwards, but there it is.
Mm-hmm. So, any final questions or anything, any remarks? Leslie, did you? Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for teaching us so much tonight. That was very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much.
So much. Very
Thank
good.
you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for your questions and comments. I appreciated them all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
So hope to see you all next Wednesday, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Have a good night. Bye, everybody.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye, Susan.
Okay. Good night. Good night. Thank you. Glad you were here.
Good night.
Good night.